Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. In early spring night, when the air carries the faint warmth of a season turning, when the semester feels both endless and fleeting, and when young people pour out of their dormitories and sorority houses into the glowing streets below with the uncomplicated joy of simply being alive and young and unburdened. Columbia, South Carolina had many such nights, and the 5 Points Entertainment District, a cluster of bars, restaurants, and late-night haunts beloved by the students of the University of South Carolina, had witnessed thousands of them. The night of March 28, 2019, sliding into the early hours of March 29th, was one of those nights. It was, for all outward appearances, ordinary. And then Samantha Josephson stepped outside into the cool air to wait for her ride home, and ordinary became something else entirely. Samantha Lee Josephson had been born on August 13, 1997, in Princeton, New Jersey, into a family defined by love, ambition, and deep pride in the girl who had grown up in the quiet township of Robbinsville. She was a young woman of uncommon promise. At 21, she was a senior at the University of South Carolina, where she had pursued a degree in political science with the kind of focused determination that her professors noticed and her family took quiet, beaming pride in. But Samantha was not simply a student. She was a whole person, vivid, curious, engaged with the world. She had joined the Alpha Gamma Delta sorority, building friendships that would stretch across years. She had studied abroad in Barcelona, wandering the cobbled streets of a European city thousands of miles from home, and she had found time to visit Madrid and Paris, carrying with her a sense of wonder that the world was large and full and hers to explore. By the spring of 2019, Samantha was standing at the very threshold of the life she had worked so hard to build. She had been accepted to Drexel University School of Law, and not merely accepted, she had earned a full scholarship, the kind of recognition that speaks to years of disciplined, intelligent effort. She had also been offered a partial scholarship to Rutgers University. Her ambition was not vague or undefined. She knew exactly what she wanted to do with the law degree that awaited her. She wanted to practice international law, to step into the complicated, consequential arena where nations and human rights and justice intersected. She was 21 years old. She had every reason to believe that the best chapters of her story were still ahead. On the evening of March 28th, Samantha joined her friends at the Bird Dog Bar in the 5 Points district, the way she had done many times before. 5 Points was familiar ground, the kind of place a college senior navigates as naturally as a hallway, knowing the exits, the faces at the bar, the rhythm of a Friday evening unfolding around her. She laughed. She talked. She was, by every account, simply a young woman enjoying the ordinary pleasures of a night out with people she cared about. At some point around 2 in the morning, she decided it was time to go home. She stepped outside into the mild March air, pulled out her phone, and opened the Uber app. She requested a ride. The app confirmed that her driver was on the way. This moment, a young woman standing on a Columbia street in the small hours of the morning, phone in hand, waiting for the car that would take her safely home, is the kind of moment that happens millions of times every day across the country without consequence. It is such an ordinary act that it barely registers as a decision. You open the app. You wait. A car pulls up. You get in. Samantha had done it before. Almost everyone who uses a ride-sharing service has done it before. The habit is so ingrained, so wrapped in the assumption of safety, that almost no one stops to verify the small but crucial details. The license plate number, the driver's name on the screen, the make and model of the vehicle, before opening the door. At approximately 2:09 in the morning, a black Chevrolet Impala pulled up alongside Samantha on the street. She looked at it and made the only calculation she had reason to make. It was a black car. It had stopped beside her, She had ordered a ride, and here was her ride. She opened the door and got in. The man behind the wheel was not her Uber driver. His name was Nathaniel Rowland, and he was 24 years old, a local man with no legitimate reason to be idling outside a 5 Points bar at 2 a.m, waiting for a woman to make a mistake. The moment Samantha settled into the back seat, Rowland reached for the controls and did something calculated and deliberate. He activated the child lock mechanism on the rear passenger doors. Child locks are designed to keep young children inside a moving vehicle. They render the rear doors impossible to open from the inside. In an instant, without Samantha's knowledge, the car that she believed was carrying her home had become a trap. What happened in the minutes and miles that followed is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Samantha Josephson, a young woman who had spent 4 years preparing to argue for justice in courts of law, who had stood in the streets of Barcelona and looked out at the wide world with curiosity and hope, was trapped in the back seat of a stranger's car, racing away from the lights of 5 Points into the darkness of a South Carolina night. At some point, she understood what was happening. Her bare feet pressed against the rear driver's side window of the car, hard enough to leave a perfect footprint impression in the glass, it conclusively to the unique patterns on the soles of her feet. She was trying to break the window. She was trying to signal someone. She was fighting, in whatever way she could, to get out. Rowland drove south, away from Columbia, through the dark and indifferent countryside of Clarendon County. He had with him a two-bladed knife, a weapon that he had carried frequently and that multiple people who knew him had seen in his possession before. At some point during the journey, or after it had ended, Rowland used that knife on Samantha Josephson with a ferocity that leaving approximately 120 separate stab wounds on her body. The exact number could not be determined, because there were simply too many to count with precision. She had wounds to her face, her neck, her shoulder, her torso, her back, her lung, her leg, and her feet. There was a wound through her right hand, a defense wound, meaning that she had raised that hand in an effort to protect herself from a blow aimed at her body. There was a wound to her head so forceful that the blade penetrated her skull and reached her brain. Her hyoid bone, a small, delicate bone in the throat, had been severed. The pathologist who examined her estimated that she had died within 10 to 20 minutes of her injuries being inflicted. When the violence was done, Rowland drove to a remote field near the town of New Zion in Clarendon County, a place where he had recently lived and where he knew the land. He dragged Samantha's body there and left her in the dark. Then he turned the car around and drove back toward Columbia. He had with him inside the vehicle a container of liquid bleach, germicidal wipes, and window cleaner, materials that tell their own story about the kind of forethought he had applied to what he intended to do that night, or to the concealment of what he had done afterward. Samantha's cell phone was also still in the car. He had not discarded it. In the hours that followed, he reportedly drove to a cell phone store and attempted to sell it. 65 miles from 5 Points, in a field outside New Zion, the night held its terrible secret in silence. The next morning, March 29th, Samantha's roommates grew concerned. She had not come home. She was not answering her phone. The person they knew, organized, responsible, a student with a full law school scholarship waiting for her, would not simply disappear without a word. They reported her missing. Columbia Police Department obtained surveillance footage from the 5 Points area and began reviewing it with urgency. What they found on the recording was the moment Samantha had stepped out of the Bird Dog Bar, waited at the curb, and then entered the black Impala. They could see her clearly. They could see the car. They worked to identify it. Meanwhile, 2 turkey hunters made their way into the fields of Clarendon County in the early morning hours of March 30th, going about the quiet, ordinary ritual of a seasonal hunt. They found Samantha Josephson's body in the field near New Zion, approximately 14 hours after she had been taken. The call went out. Investigators from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division descended on the scene. An autopsy was requested, and in Columbia, police were already moving quickly. They had identified the vehicle from the surveillance footage, a black Chevrolet Impala. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on March 30th, officers spotted a black Impala being driven through the 5 Points area, the very neighborhood where Samantha had vanished. They pulled the car over. The driver saw the police, got out of the vehicle, and ran. He did not get far. Nathaniel Rowland was caught and arrested within moments of fleeing. When investigators examined the interior of Rowland's car, the story it told was overwhelming in its detail. There was blood in the passenger seat and in the trunk, not a trace amount, not an ambiguous smear, but a large amount. There was Samantha Josephson's cell phone, still in the vehicle, the device that should have been safe in her pocket when she arrived home. There were the cleaning supplies, the bleach, the wipes, the window cleaner, evidence of a deliberate effort to erase what the car's interior contained. The child locks on the rear doors were activated. When police searched the trash outside Rowland's girlfriend's residence, they recovered the murder weapon, a two-bladed knife, as well as additional cleaning supplies. Both had Samantha's blood on them. A sock and a bandana belonging to Rowland also carried her blood. And when forensic scientists examined Rowland's fingernails, they found Samantha's DNA beneath them, the biological record of a struggle she had fought and lost. Then there was the footprint. Latent print analysts examined the rear driver's side window of the Impala and found the impression of a bare foot, the mark of a person who had pressed their sole against the glass with desperate force. Using friction ridge analysis, the same science that underlies fingerprint matching, they compared that impression against the patterns on the soles of Samantha Josephson's feet. They matched. Conclusively. Without question, the community of Columbia reeled. The University of South Carolina, where Samantha had spent 4 years building her future, launched a safety campaign they called What's My Name? A campaign aimed at teaching students to verify their rideshare driver's identity before getting into any vehicle, specifically to look at the app, check the license plate, and ask the driver to confirm the passenger's name before opening the door. The campaign's title was both a safety protocol and an act of mourning. In May 2019, at what would have been Samantha's graduation ceremony, the university awarded her a posthumous degree in political science. Her diploma and her college belongings were given to her mother, Marcy Josephson, who received them in front of a crowd of students who had known her daughter as a friend, a sorority sister, a classmate. Back in New Jersey, in the township of Robbinsville where Samantha had grown up, her parents Marcy and Seymour Josephson were doing what grieving parents do in the first weeks after an unsurvivable loss. They were trying to hold on. Seymour Josephson spoke to reporters in those early days with a rawness that was almost unbearable to witness. "I can't tell you how painful this is," he said. It was a sentence that needed no elaboration, but the Josephsons did not stop at grief. In the months that followed, they began working with legislators, traveling to state houses and committee rooms, carrying the weight of what had happened to their daughter into the fluorescent-lit corridors of government, and insisting that something be done so that it would not happen to anyone else's daughter. The legislative response was swift by the standards of lawmaking. On June 5, 2019, the state of South Carolina enacted the Samantha L. Josephson Ridesharing Safety Act, requiring rideshare vehicles to display their license plate numbers on the front of the car and creating criminal penalties for anyone who impersonated an authorized rideshare driver. New Jersey followed, with Governor Phil Murphy signing what became known as Sammy's Law, legislation requiring rideshare companies to issue identifying credential placards to their drivers, bearing the driver's name, photograph, and license plate to be displayed on the windows of the vehicle. It also required identifying markers on the windshield and a scannable barcode that passengers could use to verify their driver's identity before getting in. Nathaniel Rowland's trial began at the Richland County Courthouse in Columbia on July 20, 2021, more than 2 years after Samantha's death. In those 2 years, the evidence against him had been painstakingly assembled. Prosecutors called 31 witnesses to the stand over the course of 6 days. A procession of investigators, forensic scientists, medical experts, and people who had known Rowland in ways that illuminated the truth of his guilt. The turkey hunter who had found Samantha's body in the field outside New Zion testified. The owner of the cell phone store where Rowland had reportedly attempted to sell Samantha's phone the day after she went missing testified. Rowland's former girlfriend took the stand and told the court what she had seen and known. The knife he carried, the bleach he used, the blood she had seen in his vehicle. Dr. Thomas Beaver, the forensic pathologist who had conducted Samantha's autopsy, described for the jury the precise nature and extent of her injuries. He told them about the 120 stab wounds. He told them about the wound to her hand, the wound to her brain, the severed hyoid bone. He told them that the human body typically holds at least 4 liters of blood, and that Samantha Josephson's body, when it arrived at the medical examiner's office, contained just 20 milliliters, barely a handful. She had bled almost entirely dry. The number settled over the courtroom like something that could not be undone by language or argument. Roland's defense attorneys called no witnesses. Roland himself did not take the stand. Against 31 witnesses, against blood evidence and DNA evidence and footprint evidence, and the cell phone and the knife and the bleach and the footage of a young woman getting into a black car that was not her Uber, the defense had nothing to say. After just over 1 hour of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom on July 27, 2021. The forewoman read the verdict aloud: guilty of kidnapping, guilty of murder, guilty of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. The room absorbed the words. Marcy and Seymour Josephson, who had spent 2 years and 4 months carrying the weight of this case alongside their grief, heard the verdict in a courthouse far from the New Jersey home where they had raised their daughter. Judge Clifton Newman did not take long to speak. He addressed the court and the defendant with a gravity that needed no amplification. He called Roland heartless. He said this was the most severe murder case he had ever presided over in his years on the bench. He said that when it came to leniency, that was not part of my DNA. He sentenced Nathaniel Roland to life in prison without the possibility of parole, effective immediately. Roland spoke briefly before the sentence was delivered, maintaining his innocence in a statement that Judge Newman and the jury had clearly found to carry no weight whatsoever. His mother began to speak in his defense, and the judge interrupted her gently but unmistakably, reminding her that her son had been convicted of murder by 12 people who had heard every piece of evidence and deliberated before reaching their decision. The law had spoken. It had taken the name of the woman Roland had killed, and it had spoken it clearly. In August 2024, the South Carolina Court of Appeals upheld Roland's conviction when his legal team sought to challenge it. In September of that year, the same court denied a second request for a new hearing. Every door Nathaniel Roland attempted to open in pursuit of his freedom remained, and continues to remain, closed. Samantha Josephson is buried at the Prineville Jewish Cemetery in Prineville, New Jersey, in the state where she was born, not far from the township where she grew up. The patio and rock garden that the township of Robbinsville built in her memory sit in the community that shaped her, a quiet and permanent acknowledgement that she was here, that she mattered, and that her absence is felt. What endures most forcefully about Samantha Josephson's story is not only the horror of what was done to her, but the full and vivid life that was interrupted. She was 21 years old. She had a scholarship to law school. She had walked the streets of Barcelona and stood in front of the Eiffel Tower and come home full of ideas about what the world was and what she might do in it. She had friends who loved her, parents who were proud of her, a sister who shared her childhood with her. She had ordered a car to take her safely home, and she had taken one small, terribly understandable step toward the wrong vehicle, and the world that had been waiting for her, the courtrooms and the international cases and the decades of meaningful work, simply vanished. Sammy's Law cannot bring her back. The What's My Name Foundation cannot bring her back. The posthumous diploma presented to her mother at the graduation ceremony she did not live to attend cannot bring her back. But they are, in their way, the answer a family gives to an unbearable question. The question of what you do when the worst has already happened, and the only thing you can control is what comes after. Marcy and Seymour Josephson chose to make their daughter's name mean something beyond grief. They chose to make it mean safety and caution, and the insistence that the people who travel alone in the small hours of the morning, the young students and the night shift workers, and the people just trying to get home, deserve to get there. Every time a rider checks a license plate before stepping into a car, every time a driver displays their credentials visibly in a window, every time the simple habit of asking, "What's my name?" is practiced before a door is opened. In all those moments, a 21-year-old girl from Robbinsville, New Jersey, with a full scholarship to law school and a passion for international justice and a future that was entirely her own, is quietly, persistently, powerfully present. Story 2. The village of Long Clawson sits quietly in the Leicestershire countryside, tucked among gently rolling fields and winding lanes that give no hint of the darkness that can take root in the most ordinary of places. It is the kind of village where neighbors know each other's faces, where dogs bark in the mornings, and where the evening light settles in a golden haze over the rooftops of its modest bungalows. It was in one such bungalow, on a September evening in 2023, that 37-year-old Carrie Slater drew her last independent breath, the victim of a violence so brutal and yet so carefully hidden that it took the work of forensic science to reveal the truth of what had happened to her. Carrie Slater was, by all accounts, a woman who deserved better than the life she had been quietly suffering through. She was a beloved daughter, a devoted sister, and a doting auntie, described by those who knew her best as someone who could fill a room with warmth. She had a life before Richard Bosson, a life of family ties, of friendships, of independence. But when she met Bosson in 2017, the world she had known began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to contract. But when she moved in with Bosson, she started to lose contact with her family. It is a detail that, on the surface, seems almost unremarkable. But for those who understand the quiet mechanics of coercive control, it is a detail that explains almost everything. Richard Bosson was 44 years old, a man whose outward ordinariness concealed a web of dangerous secrets. He was a drug addict whose grip on reality had been steadily loosened by years of substance dependency. He was also, by the time of the events that ended Carrie's life, illegally storing not one but 3 firearms on behalf of an associate. A fact that speaks volumes about the kind of world he had drawn himself into, and the kind of world he had, in drawing Carrie close, drawn her into as well. Among those weapons was a semi-automatic, self-loading pistol, loaded with live ammunition, kept somewhere within the walls of their shared home. Carrie may or may not have known the gun existed. What is certain is that she could never have imagined the way in which it would one day be used. To understand what happened on the evening of September 21st, 2023, one must first understand the atmosphere that had settled over the couple's bungalow on King's Road. Theirs was not a peaceful home. Bosson was a man defined by control, coercive, dominant, and relentless in his need to hold power over the woman who lived beside him. Arguments were not a rarity between them. But there is something about the arguments of people living under this kind of dynamic that feels different from ordinary domestic disagreements. They carry a charge, an undercurrent of threat that never quite dissipates. By all indications, that charge was present on this particular evening, as the September sun began to lower itself behind the Leicestershire hills, and the village fell into the quiet routines of early evening. The exact sequence of words exchanged between Carrie and Bosson in the moments before the first shot was fired is known only to one person, and that person has never told the truth about it. May an argument broke out, that it escalated, and that at some point Bosson retrieved the semi-automatic pistol he was illegally holding and turned it toward the woman he claimed to love. He fired. The first shot missed her. It struck the wall of the room instead, lodging itself in the plaster. A terrible, thunderous sound that must have shattered the air of that small bedroom, that must have caused Carrie to reel backward, to duck and flinch in shock and terror. For a single, suspended moment, perhaps she believed that the worst had passed. Perhaps, in the ringing silence that follows a gunshot, there was still time for the world to right itself. But there was no such mercy. Bosson fired again. The second bullet struck Carrie in the front of the head. The injury it caused was a devastating brain injury, unsurvivable, catastrophic, the kind of wound that leaves no room for hope. She collapsed. The woman who had laughed and loved, who had been someone's daughter and someone's sister, lay motionless in the bedroom of the bungalow she shared with the man who had just shot her. The evening continued outside. Birds moved through the cooling air. A neighbor perhaps walked past the front gate. The world carried on with the terrible indifference it always shows to private catastrophe. Inside, Richard Bosson began to think. And what he thought about, in those first moments after shooting Carrie, was not how to save her. It was how to save himself. The instinct for self-preservation, in its most naked and morally destitute form, took over completely. Bosson moved through the bungalow with a purpose that is, in retrospect, almost incomprehensible, methodical, deliberate, cold. He went to the wall and retrieved the bullet that had lodged there from his first missed shot, understanding that a spent round was evidence, that it could be connected to a gun, that it could be connected to him. He took both the recovered bullet and the pistol itself and carried them out to the back garden, where he hid them among the earth and the weeds and the unremarkable debris of an ordinary domestic exterior. Then he went back inside and wiped down surfaces, cleaning away fingerprints, erasing the residue of what he had done with the mundane tools of household tidiness. Only after he had done all of this did he pick up the phone and call 999. The call he made was one of the most extraordinary acts of deception in the entire case. Speaking to the call handler in a voice that carried the trembling performance of a distressed man, Basan constructed a story that was, he told the operator that Carrie had been injured by a pool cue, that he had been jabbing the cue as a kind of warning gesture, and that Carrie had walked directly into it with her head down. "I stabbed her in the face with a pool cue, but I didn't mean to stab her," he said, his words now a matter of recorded public record. "I meant like just warn her and like jab at her, and she walked straight into it with her head down." He described the cue as brass-ended, and when pressed about the nature of the wound, its location, its path through the front of her head, he described it with a precision that betrayed, to those who would later listen carefully, a man who knew exactly what he had done. The emergency services arrived quickly. Paramedics and police officers entered the bungalow and found Carrie in the bedroom, her head carrying a wound so grievous that all efforts at resuscitation began immediately. Basan, meanwhile, had moved outside. He stood in front of the bungalow, behaving erratically, refusing to cooperate with officers. Yet in a moment that seemed, superficially, like an admission of culpability, he confirmed to arriving officers that he had caused her injuries, maintaining his fiction about the pool cue. He was arrested on suspicion of causing grievous bodily harm with intent, which was, at that stage, the most logical charge given the information police had. Carrie was rushed to hospital. There, the machinery of modern medicine did what it could, but the damage to her brain was beyond repair. And it was the hospital, with its scanners and its trained medical eyes, that first unraveled Basan's story. Because when radiographers and doctors examined the wound in Carrie's head, that terrible entry point in the center of her forehead, what they saw was not consistent with any kind of blow. It was consistent with a bullet. It was a gunshot wound. Police returned to the bungalow. Now they were looking not for a pool cue, but for a weapon, for ammunition, for the evidence of a crime far graver than the one Basan had described. In the back garden, partially concealed among the earth and the vegetation, they found what they were looking for: a self-loading pistol and 4 rounds of ammunition, 2 of which were spent. The spent casings were matched. The recovered bullet from the wall, retrieved by Basan himself in his panicked attempt to hide the truth, had been hidden alongside the gun. The forensic picture that emerged was damning and complete. Richard Basan had shot Carrie Slater twice in the bedroom of their shared home, retrieved the evidence of his first shot, hidden the weapon, wiped the surfaces clean, and then fabricated a story so implausible that the presiding judge would describe it as an absurdity, an attempt to make a bullet seem like the brass tip of a pool cue. 2 days after she was shot, on September 23, 2023, the doctors who had fought to keep Carrie Slater alive made the heartbreaking decision to withdraw life support. The post-mortem examination confirmed what the hospital scans had shown. She had died as a direct result of a gunshot wound to the head. She was 37 years old. Basan was formally charged with her murder. The period between the charge and the trial was one of sustained and careful legal examination. Investigators, led by Detective Inspector Emma Matz of Leicestershire Police, worked to build the fullest possible picture of what had happened, not just on the night of September 21st, but across the years that had led to it. What emerged was a portrait of a relationship defined by imbalance of power. Basan had been coercive, dominant, and controlling toward Carrie throughout the 7 years they had spent together, the court would hear. He had systematically eroded her connections to the outside world, to the family members who had known and loved her, until she existed almost entirely within the orbit of a man who saw her less as a partner and more as a possession. This pattern, the gradual isolation, the slow extinction of independence, the subordination of one person's will to another's, is one that appears again and again in cases of domestic homicide, and it is a pattern that investigators and prosecutors work hard to establish in court, because it provides the essential context without which the final act of violence seems inexplicable. The trial at Leicester Crown Court was a serious and sober proceeding. Basan maintained his defense, denying that he had murdered Carrie. But the evidence arrayed against him was formidable. There was the 999 recording, in which his own voice described a wound with a specificity that only knowledge of a gunshot could provide. There was the forensic evidence from the bedroom, the traces of gunshot residue, the trajectory of the bullet, the impact point on the wall that proved the first shot had missed. There were the gun and the ammunition recovered from the garden. There was medical testimony from the hospital confirming the nature of the wound. And there was the testimony that spoke to the character of the relationship, the years of control, the isolation, the fear. Together, these threads formed a rope that Basan's defense could not cut. The jury returned a verdict of guilty. Richard Basan was convicted of the murder of Carrie Slater. The courtroom, which had spent days absorbing the clinical language of forensic evidence and legal argument, fell for a moment into the quiet that follows a judgment. That strange, suspended pause between the pronouncement of a word and the full comprehension of what it means. Sentencing took place on March 26, 2024, at Leicester Crown Court. Judge Martin Spencer addressed Basan directly and without equivocation. He told him that he had spun a web of lies and offered a plethora of false accounts to conceal what he had done. He told him that his motivation had been saving his own skin rather than any concern for Carrie. He noted that Basan had also, at some point in his interactions with police, falsely claimed that Carrie had attacked him with a knife. Yet another invented fiction layered atop the original lie about the pool cue. The judge observed that it seemed likely that an argument had broken out and that Basan had simply overreacted, lost his temper, and fired. He noted, with a particular kind of judicial dryness, that Basan may have believed, absurdly, that the retrieved bullet, once hidden, might somehow be passed off as the brass-ended tip of a pool cue. The sentence handed down was life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 32 years before Basan would even be eligible to be considered for parole. He also received a concurrent 6-year sentence for the illegal possession of the firearm and a concurrent 30 months for holding ammunition without a certificate. At 45 years old, Richard Basan would be in his late 70s before the law would so much as consider the question of his release. In the aftermath of the sentencing, Carrie's family released a tribute that managed, in the face of profound grief, to speak not of anger but of love. They described her as a beloved daughter, sister, and auntie, words that carry no legal weight but carry everything that matters. Detective Inspector Emma Matz, who had led the investigation from the beginning, gave a statement that reflected something of the weight she and her team had carried through the months-long process of building the case. My thoughts and condolences go out to Carrie's family and loved ones, who I know are still struggling to come to terms with their loss and understand why Carrie was killed, she said. Only Basan knows why he killed a woman he claimed to love. He's never explained his actions. He's never shown any remorse for killing another person. That last sentence lingers. He's never shown any remorse. It is perhaps the most revealing thing about Richard Basan. More revealing than the forensic evidence, more revealing than the lies catalogued by the judge, more revealing even than the act itself. A man who shoots his partner in the head, constructs an elaborate cover story, and then sits through a trial maintaining his innocence without ever, at any moment, pausing to acknowledge the human being whose life he extinguished, is a man whose interior world we will never fully understand. And perhaps we do not need to understand it. Perhaps it is enough simply to say his name alongside hers, Richard Basan alongside Carrie Slater, so that the record is clear and the balance of the story is not lost. Carrie Slater was not simply a victim. She was 37 years old. She had people who loved her deeply enough to grieve her still, a year and more after she was gone. She had a life before the bungalow in Long Clawson, a life of connection and warmth that the man who claimed to love her spent 7 years quietly dismantling, until the night he decided to take what little remained. The village of Long Clawson has returned to its quiet rhythms since then. The bungalow on King's Road stands as it did. But somewhere in that village, in the people who knew her, in the officers who worked her case, in the family that mourns her still, Carrie Slater is not forgotten. Story 3. There are evenings that look exactly like all the others. A workday ending, a daughter expecting her mother home for dinner, the familiar quiet of a Texas summer stretching out ahead. July 9th, 1999 was one of those evenings. The air in Beaumont, Texas carried the thick, pressing heat that settles over southeast Texas in July, the kind of heat that makes a person look forward to going home. Kimberly and Langwell had finished her shift, stepped out into that heat, and pointed herself in the direction of familiar places and familiar people. She had a daughter waiting for her. She had a dinner to get home to. She had, in every sense that matters, a reason to return. She never did. What followed that evening was 25 years of silence, of unanswered questions, of a daughter growing into adulthood with a wound that never fully closed, and of a man living his ordinary life above a secret buried under his bedroom floor. The story of Kimberly Langwell is a story about the patience of grief, the persistence of investigators who refused to let a case go cold forever, and the moment, decades in the making, when the earth finally gave up what had been hidden inside it. Kimberly Langwell was born on February 24, 1965, and by the summer of 1999, she was 34 years old and living in Beaumont, a city of roughly 115,000 people in Jefferson County, tucked into the eastern corner of Texas near the Louisiana border. Beaumont was the kind of city where neighbors knew each other, where the same families had lived on the same streets for generations, and where a disappearance did not go unnoticed. Kimberly was a fixture in the lives of people around her, sharp-tongued in the way that makes people laugh, possessed of what her family later described as a witty, dry sense of humor that could make your mouth drop and make you laugh at the same time. She was, by anyone's account, someone who filled a room simply by entering it. She was also a mother. That fact, the particular devotion with which Kimberly had organized her life around her daughter Tiffany, is inseparable from the story of who she was. She worked hard, sometimes holding down 3 jobs at once, because providing for Tiffany was not a secondary concern or an afterthought. It was the primary engine of her daily existence. Nothing stood in her way. Tiffany was 15 years old in the summer of 1999, at the precise age where a teenager is beginning to understand her mother as a full person, not merely a parent. She was old enough to know that Kimberly worked exhausting hours, and young enough to still be waiting by the door when her mother was supposed to come home. On the evening of July 9th, 1999, Tiffany was waiting. She and her mother had made plans for dinner. It was the kind of ordinary plan families make without thinking twice, a meal, a shared table, the end of a Friday. Kimberly had left her job at around 5:13 in the afternoon. Before heading home, she had one stop to make. She planned to visit the home of her ex-boyfriend, a man named Terry Rose. The relationship had ended before that evening. Kimberly had moved on from it. But people stop by ex-partners' homes all the time for reasons that seem entirely ordinary in the moment. To return something, to have a brief conversation, to close a chapter cleanly. There was nothing in the plan that should have alarmed anyone. The stop at Terry Rose's house was the last thing Kimberly Langwell ever did. Terry Rose was a man who had, on the surface, the kind of life that passed without comment in a working-class Texas neighborhood. He was a tow truck operator, a man who dealt in breakdowns, in the mechanical failures of other people's days. He lived in a house at 1655 Lindbergh Drive, off Washington Boulevard in Beaumont, a residential address that would one day become the center of a homicide investigation, but which in the summer of 1999 was simply where he lived. He and Kimberly had been together for a time, and she had ended the relationship. In the private interior of a man like Terry Rose, what that ending meant, and what he was willing to do about it, was something that no one outside his own mind fully understood. On the evening of July 9th, Kimberly drove to Lindbergh Drive. She arrived, walked in, and what happened inside that house is something that would not be known in its full, terrifying detail until 25 years later, when an informant finally spoke the words that investigators had spent decades waiting to hear. Inside that house, on that summer evening, Terry Rose shot Kimberly Langwell in the back of the head. She died in the home of a man she had trusted enough to visit alone. What happened next speaks to a specific and chilling kind of deliberateness. Rose did not panic. He did not call for help. He did not flee. Instead, he carried out a plan that could only have been conceived in the coldest part of a person's thinking. He wrapped Kimberly's body in a blanket and buried her beneath the floor of his own bedroom. Not somewhere distant, not in a field outside of town, but directly below the room where he slept. He poured concrete over the cavity, sealing her inside the very structure of the house. And then he turned his attention to the question of her car. This is where a former co-worker named David Wiley enters the story. Wiley, a tow truck driver who worked for Rose, on the evening of July 9th, Rose had asked him to come to a Walmart and meet him between 5 and 6 o'clock in the evening. When Wiley arrived, he found something that surprised him. Rose was sitting in Kimberly Langwell's car. Rose was the ex-boyfriend. This was unmistakably the vehicle of Rose's ex-girlfriend. Wiley was puzzled, but Rose offered nothing in the way of explanation. Rose parked the car, climbed into Wiley's tow truck, and the two of them went to play pool at a business located in the same Westmont shopping center. The same parking lot where Kimberly's car now sat, locked, with her purse and keys still inside. Rose said nothing about Kimberly that evening. He simply played pool, the way a man plays pool when he has nothing to hide. The next morning, Tiffany reported that her mother had never come home. The investigation that began on July 10, 1999, when Beaumont police arrived at the family home to take a missing persons report, would stretch across a quarter of a century. Officers searched. Leads were followed. The abandoned car in the Westmont shopping center parking lot was processed. The purse inside, the keys, the locked doors. Nothing about the car suggested that its owner had walked away willingly. Everything about it suggested that wherever Kimberly had gone, she had not gone voluntarily. In 2003, Texas EquiSearch, the volunteer search and rescue organization that has helped families find missing loved ones across the state, became involved in the case. Searches were conducted. Additional locations were investigated. Each year that passed without an answer added another layer of weight to the grief that Tiffany and the rest of Kimberly's family carried. Meanwhile, on Lindbergh Drive, Terry Rose continued to live his life. He ate, slept, and moved through his days inside the same house where Kimberly was buried. His daughter, the room beneath whose floor Kimberly lay, had been her own childhood bedroom. Rose's daughter had grown up sleeping above the remains of a murdered woman. Whether she knew or suspected anything is not part of the established record. What is part of the record is that Rose, during the years of Kimberly's disappearance, even helped put up a billboard designed to locate her. He played the role of a concerned former acquaintance while the woman he had killed lay sealed under the concrete beneath his feet. This performance, the billboard, the silence, the ordinary life constructed directly above a secret, is among the most disturbing dimensions of the case. It required Rose to hold two realities simultaneously: the public-facing version of a man who knew nothing, and the private truth of a man who knew everything. For 25 years, those two realities coexisted inside him without cracking. The crack, when it finally came from outside. In April 2024, a reliable informant came forward and provided Beaumont Police Department detectives with specific, credible information. According to what the informant told investigators, Rose had disclosed to this person, shortly after Kimberly disappeared in July 1999, that he had shot her in the back of the head and buried her on his property at Lindbergh Drive. The informant had carried that knowledge for 25 years. What finally moved them to speak it aloud, after so many years of silence, is one of the quiet mysteries at the edge of this case. One of those human decisions that changes everything for the people waiting on the other side of it. The informant came forward. The detectives listened carefully, and then they moved. Investigators obtained an evidentiary residential search warrant for the property at 1655 Lindbergh Drive. On June 13, 2024, exactly 25 years and 4 days after Kimberly had walked into that house and never walked back out, law enforcement officers arrived at Terry Rose's address with the warrant and began to search. They proceeded through the house with the methodical attention that a search of this kind demands, measuring spaces, checking foundations, looking beneath surfaces that had been sealed for decades. In the bedroom, beneath the floorboards, they found a cavity. Inside the cavity, wrapped in a blanket, were human remains. DNA analysis subsequently confirmed what the informant had said and what investigators had begun to believe. The remains were those of Kimberly and Langwell, who had been 34 years old and planning to have dinner with her daughter when she died. Rose was arrested the same day the remains were found, June 13, 2024. He was 67 years old. He was taken into custody and held on a bond of $1 million. The charge, murder. The arrest marked the beginning of a legal proceeding that would wind through 2024 and into 2025. A psychiatrist evaluated Rose and determined he was competent to stand trial. The evidence assembled against him was formidable. The informant's testimony, the DNA confirmation of the remains, the location of the remains precisely where the informant had said they would be found, and the testimony of David Wiley, who could place Rose behind the wheel of Kimberly's car on the very evening she vanished. The picture that the evidence painted was one of a man who had not only committed murder, but had then used Kimberly's own vehicle to stage the appearance of an abandonment, parking the car in the shopping center lot, leaving the purse and keys inside, making it appear as though Kimberly had simply walked away. In December 2025, Terry Rose entered a plea of guilty to the murder of Kimberly and Langwell. Under the terms of a plea agreement, his sentence would be capped at 40 years. On December 15th and 16th, 2025, 26 years after the crime, the sentencing hearing took place in a Jefferson County courtroom before Judge Raquel West. The hearing was not a quiet procedural event. It was charged with the kind of emotion that only decades of grief can produce when it finally finds a room in which to speak. David Wiley, the former tow truck driver, took the stand and confirmed what he had witnessed that July evening. The sight of Rose and Kimberly's car, the parking of the vehicle, the pool game played in silence. And then, when prosecutors asked him directly whether Rose had later admitted to shooting Kimberly and burying her, Wiley said yes. He testified that Rose had told him, not long after Kimberly disappeared, exactly what he had done, that he had shot her in the back of the head and buried her under the concrete slab of his bedroom. Wiley had known for 25 years, and in the courtroom, visibly affected, he answered the question of why he had not come forward sooner, a question he had clearly been asking himself as well. Rose had also, in a jail phone call recorded while he was awaiting sentencing, revealed something of his own attitude toward the proceedings. Upon learning the terms of his plea deal, 40 years, the maximum allowed under the agreement, he described it as an insult. The remark, played in court or noted in proceedings, landed with a particular weight. Here was a man who had shot a woman in the back of the head, buried her body beneath his bedroom floor, slept above her remains for 25 years, helped put up a billboard pretending to search for her, and watched her daughter grow up without her, and he considered a 40-year sentence an insult. Judge Raquel West sentenced Rose to the maximum 40 years. Her words at sentencing were direct and unsparing. She described his actions as the definition of a psychopath. The sentence meant that Rose, who was 68 at the time of sentencing, would almost certainly spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. But the moment in that courtroom that carried the most weight was not the judge's sentence, and it was not the guilty plea. It was the statement delivered by Tiffany McGinnis, Kimberly's daughter, who had been 15 years old on the July evening when her mother didn't come home for dinner, and who was now a grown woman standing in a courtroom to speak about what those 25 years had cost her. Tiffany had grown up in the absence of her mother. She had graduated from school, formed relationships, built a life, all while carrying the particular kind of grief that belongs to people who don't know what happened to someone they love. The grief that has no clear object, that cannot be aimed at a grave or a confirmed cause, that exists in a permanent state of incompletion. For 25 years, she had not known whether her mother was alive somewhere in the world, or dead, or what combination of hope and dread to feel when she thought about that July evening. She had not known who had done it, or why, or where her mother was. She had known only that Kimberly had left work at 5:13 on a Friday afternoon, and had never come home to the dinner they had planned. In October 2024, after the DNA confirmation of the remains, Kimberly Langwell was finally laid to rest at Rosedale Cemetery in Sour Lake, Texas. A funeral service was held at Broussard's mortuary in Beaumont, and people who had known Kimberly, people who had carried her memory across a quarter century, gathered to give her a burial that had been 25 years overdue. Her obituary spoke of a woman whose greatest joy in life had been her daughter, whose hard work and three-job dedication had defined her years, and whose dry humor had stayed with everyone who had ever laughed at something she said. Kim was a friend to many people, the obituary noted, and through the years we have met several people that have shared their stories with us about Kim. Stories that have made us smile and cry at the same time. The story of Kimberly Langwell is, in one sense, a story about a cold case solved, about a tip that came in after 25 years, about investigators who still had the files, about forensic work that matched DNA to remains found under a bedroom floor. It is a story about the mechanics of justice, delayed but not entirely denied. But in another and more personal sense, it is a story about a 15-year-old girl who waited by the door for a mother who was already gone, and who spent the next quarter of a century waiting for someone to tell her the truth. The truth came. It came because someone finally decided, after 25 years, that the weight of knowing was heavier than the weight of speaking. It came because Beaumont's investigators never fully closed the file. It came because the earth beneath a bedroom floor held what had been entrusted to it on a July evening in 1999, and gave it back when the time arrived. Kimberly Langwell was 34 years old. She worked 3 jobs to take care of her daughter. She had a sense of humor that made people's mouths drop and then made them laugh. She was driving home from work on a Friday evening, and she made one stop that she expected to take a few minutes, after which she planned to have dinner with the girl she had built her entire life around. That dinner never happened. But 26 years later, in a Jefferson County courtroom, the man who made sure it never happened finally stood before a judge and answered for it. And the daughter who had waited all that time finally heard someone say, out loud, in a room built for the purpose, that what had been done to her mother was wrong, and that the law had not forgotten it. Story 4. There is a lie that is almost impossible to believe because of the sheer audacity it requires. A lie told not in the quiet aftermath of a crime, but in the very room where the crime has just been committed, delivered with the performative calm of someone who has imagined this moment before. The story of what happened inside a Appleton, Wisconsin apartment on the evening of July 18, 2024, is a story built around precisely that kind of lie. It is a story about a woman who stabbed the man she claimed to love, kissed him while he was dying, and then turned to the people standing in that room and told them what they needed to say. It is a story about a man named Joey Carnau who had, before that evening, reportedly told at least one person in his life that he was afraid of what Samantha Krebs might do to him. And it is a story about the patience and determination of a Wisconsin courtroom that refused to let the truth be buried beneath the version of events that Krebs had constructed in the moments after the blade came down. Samantha Jean Krebs was 40 years old in the summer of 2024, and she was a woman whose life had been defined, for more than a decade, by the gravity of poor choices compounding upon one another. Her criminal history was not a footnote in her biography. It was, in many ways, the dominant narrative of her adult years. Krebs had accumulated 20 prior criminal cases and 37 convictions. The charges that ran through that record like a dark thread included drugs possession, injury by negligent use of a weapon, and multiple counts of battery. In 2011, she had been charged with substantial battery, a charge that had eventually been reduced, and the years that followed had not produced a clean break from that pattern. She had been in and out of the Wisconsin criminal justice system repeatedly, had served time in custody, and had, by the summer of 2024, developed a particular and acute fear of returning to prison. That fear would become, within hours of Joey Carnau's death, the first and most revealing thing that escaped her lips. She was on probation when she killed him. Joey Carnau was, by all accounts from the people who knew him, a man navigating the difficult intersections of addiction and daily life that so many people in Wisconsin's working communities know intimately. He and Krebs shared a relationship that had the combustible chemistry of two people whose lives were both marked by substance use. A relationship that was volatile in specific ways that the people around them had noticed and worried about. Joey had previously expressed fear that Krebs might stab him to his friend. That is a detail worth sitting with, not a vague unease, not a general worry about the health of their relationship, but a specific, named fear. The fear that his partner might one day use a blade against him. He had said it aloud to someone. He had trusted someone with that fear. The apartment the couple shared sat on Park Lane Drive in Appleton, a mid-sized city in Wisconsin's Fox River Valley, the seat of Outagamie County. July 18, 2024, began with the ordinary texture of a summer day in the Midwest, warm, unhurried. The kind of day that gives no external signal of what is building inside a specific apartment behind a specific closed door. What happened inside that apartment during the hours that led up to the stabbing is not fully documented. Relationships like theirs were not conducted under observation, and the interior emotional weather of that evening, the argument that may have started it, the sequence of exchanges that ended in violence, belongs to the category of things that only one living person knows in full. At some point during the evening of July 18th, Samantha Krebs stabbed Joey Carnau in the chest. The wound was catastrophic. A knife driven into the human chest with sufficient force strikes at the very engine of life, the heart, the lungs, the architecture of survival. And the damage it causes is not the kind that a person recovers from quickly, if at all. Joey was gravely injured. He was in the apartment, wounded and dying, when other friends arrived at the scene. What those friends found was a picture that Krebs had already begun to arrange. When the others entered the apartment and saw Joey with stab wounds, Krebs was present. And in the chaotic, terrible moments that followed, rather than calling for emergency help with the urgency that the situation demanded, Krebs did something that would define the entire case against her. She turned to the people who had arrived and told them to tell the police that Joey had stabbed himself. She said it plainly, as a directive, the way a person gives an instruction they expect to be followed. She was thinking, in that moment, not about whether Joey could be saved, but about the story that would have to be told when the police arrived. She was constructing the architecture of her defense while Joey Carnau's life was still ebbing away in that apartment. And then she kissed him goodbye. That detail, the kiss, is the one that the media and the public seized upon, and it is not hard to understand why. It is an image of such dissonance that the mind struggles to hold both parts of it simultaneously. A woman who had just stabbed a man, pressing her lips to his in a gesture of farewell, even as she was simultaneously managing the false narrative she intended to leave behind. Whether the kiss was an expression of something genuine, guilt, grief, the complicated residue of feeling for a person you have just mortally wounded, or whether it was something colder, a calculated performance for the benefit of the witnesses in the room, is something that no one can say with certainty. What is certain is what happened immediately after. Krebs told the others she could not go back to prison. She said it directly, without apparent awareness of how damning the statement would later sound in a courtroom. "I can't go back to prison." And then she left the apartment. She was not there when law enforcement arrived at the scene. When police reached her by phone, she offered an account of the evening that carefully avoided any acknowledgement of what she had done. She told officers that Joey had been going through difficulties with court proceedings and had been upset because she had left. She said she had departed the apartment around 7 in the evening because he had begun acting erratically. It was a version of events designed to position her as a concerned partner who had removed herself from a difficult situation, not as the person who had created the crisis in the first place. But the witnesses who had been inside that apartment had heard what Krebs had told them to say, and at least one of them, instead of following those instructions, told the truth. The investigation that unfolded in the days and weeks after Joey Carnau's death assembled a case that was, in its essential structure, not complex. The complexity lay not in the evidence, but in the deliberateness of what Krebs had attempted. She had tried to build a false version of events in real time, recruiting the people around her as participants in a cover story, banking on the fear and confusion of the immediate aftermath to make her account stick. What she had not fully accounted for was that the witnesses were not compliant, that at least one of them had already heard Joey express his specific fear of being stabbed by her, and that the statement she had made about not going back to prison would ring through every subsequent interview like a bell that could not be unrung. Prosecutors charged Samantha Krebs with first-degree intentional homicide under Wisconsin law. The charge was not manslaughter, not a crime of passion mitigated by circumstance. It was intentional homicide, the most serious classification of killing available under Wisconsin's criminal code. District Attorney Mindy Tempelis led the prosecution, presenting the case as what she described as a domestic violence homicide driven by manipulation, addiction, and control. Tempelis laid out the full scope of Krebs's criminal history: 20 prior cases, 37 convictions, a pattern of escalating violence that stretched across more than a decade, and argued that this history was not background noise, but essential context for understanding who Samantha Krebs was and what she was capable of doing. The witness who had heard Joey express his fear of being stabbed by Krebs took the stand, giving the jury a window into the private anxiety that Joey had carried inside that relationship. The witness who had heard Krebs say she could not go back to prison testified to those precise words, spoken in the room where Joey lay dying. The defense rested on Krebs's consistent claim. Joey Carnau had died by suicide. He had stabbed himself, she maintained, and she had witnessed the aftermath of a self-inflicted wound, not a murder she had committed. Her lawyers pointed to Joey's history with substance use, to the emotional turbulence of his state of mind, and to Krebs's own account of leaving the apartment because of his erratic behavior. It was a defense that required the jury to accept that a man had stabbed himself fatally in the chest, that the woman who had just been present had coincidentally told witnesses to claim he had stabbed himself, essentially corroborating the truth through a fabricated instruction, and that the statement about not going back to prison had been said in shock, not in calculation. After more than 5.5 hours of deliberations, the jury returned its verdict on September 11, 2025. Guilty. First-degree intentional homicide. The verdict was not a surprise to those who had followed the evidence closely, but it was, nonetheless, a moment of gravity. Joey Carnau was dead. His killer had been named by 12 of his peers in the most formal setting available under the law. The lie had not held. Sentencing was set for November 2025, and what took place in Judge Vincent Biskupic's courtroom in Outagamie County on November 24th and 25th was a proceeding charged with the accumulated weight of everything that had led to that day. District Attorney Tempe Lee stood before the judge and argued that Krebs's 37 prior convictions, her probation status at the time of the killing, and the jail phone calls that had been recorded in the months since her arrest, calls in which she had laughed and cackled, seemingly indifferent to the gravity of her situation, all pointed toward a conclusion that she posed a continued and serious risk to public safety. Tempe Lee pushed for a life sentence without the possibility of early release. Before the sentence was delivered, Krebs addressed the court. She stood in the place where every convicted person must eventually stand and spoke about Joey, about the experiences she had shared with people who had contemplated or died by suicide, about her regrets for how she had conducted herself on the night of his death. She maintained, even now, even after the jury's verdict, that Joey had died by suicide. She acknowledged making wrong decisions while high and in shock, but she drew a line between those admitted failings and the act the jury had found her responsible for. "I never will understand," she told the court, "the fact that anyone would believe, even for a second, that I would hurt Joey." She said she did not feel she deserved to spend her life in prison for what had happened. Judge Biskupic considered all of it, the testimony, the history, the jail calls, and Krebs's statement, and then he delivered his sentence. Life in prison, he said, with eligibility for extended supervision, Wisconsin's equivalent of parole, after serving 36 years. She would be in her mid-70s before a board could even consider releasing her. In the sentencing remarks he delivered before handing down that term, Judge Biskupic was direct about his reasoning. Krebs's long immersion in the culture of addiction and violence, he said, should have been a lesson to her, a warning that the direction she was traveling led to violent outcomes. He called portions of her account at trial window dressing, a polite term for something the evidence had identified as far less polite. He told her he hoped she would use her time in custody to do something different from what she had done with her freedom. It was not a cruel statement. It was the statement of a judge who had looked at 40 years of one human life and found a pattern that ended, predictably and tragically, in the death of someone who had been afraid of exactly this. Joey Carnau had told someone he was afraid of being stabbed by Samantha Krebs. He had named the specific fear, not a vague anxiety about their relationship, but a specific, physical, named fear. And on July 18, 2024, the fear he had named came true in the apartment they shared on Park Lane Drive in Appleton, Wisconsin. He died with a stab wound to the chest, and the woman who inflicted it kissed him and left before the police arrived. The case of Samantha Krebs is, in one sense, a case about domestic violence, about the particular danger that exists when two people in a volatile relationship are also entangled in the grip of addiction, and about the way that danger can build silently until it cannot be contained anymore. It is about the failure to recognize warning signs, or the recognition of them without a clear path to safety. Joey had seen the warning and spoken it aloud. But speaking of fear to a friend and being protected from it are two different things, and the distance between those two things is where tragedies live. A man who was afraid, a woman who could not stop herself, and a courtroom in Wisconsin that spent months working through the evidence until it could say, with the full weight of the law behind it, what had actually happened inside that apartment on a July evening when no one was watching except the people Krebs had asked to lie. They didn't lie, and because they didn't, a verdict was possible. And because a verdict was possible, Joey Carnau's name was spoken in a court of law not as the author of his own death, but as a victim, the only title in the end that the evidence supported. Story 5. The town of Little Compton, Rhode Island, sits at the very southeastern edge of the state, perched on a narrow peninsula where the land meets both the Sakonnet River and the cold gray Atlantic in a meeting of water and sky that seems almost too beautiful to be part of ordinary life. It is a community of old stone walls and weathered cedar shingle houses, of greenhouses tended with the devotion that other people reserve for cathedrals, of neighbors who wave at each other from across the road and who notice, without being told, when something is wrong. It is the kind of place where violence is not merely shocking but genuinely alien, a thing that happens elsewhere, in cities and in the fevered accounts of the evening news, but not here, not in this quiet corner of New England where the salt air and the garden soil define the rhythms of daily life. In the spring of 1999, nothing in Little Compton gave any indication that this peace was about to be shattered. The Memorial Day weekend was approaching, carrying with it the first real warmth of a New England summer, and the community was alive with the small, lovely rituals that mark a turning season. At the greenhouse at Peckham's Garden Center, employees were readying plants and flowers for the weekend rush. The garden club was planning its season. Life in Little Compton was proceeding exactly as it always had, in its dependable, unhurried way. Angela Spence Shaw was 66 years old in the spring of 1999, and she was, in almost every possible sense, the kind of person a community like Little Compton produces and then builds itself around. She was a widow, living alone in her home on Sakonnet Point Road. But alone is perhaps the wrong word for a woman whose days were as full of connection and purpose as Angela's were. She worked at Peckham's greenhouse, rising in the mornings to surround herself with green growing things, to serve her neighbors in a shop that smelled of earth and new growth. She was on the very threshold of taking over as president of the Little Compton Garden Club, a position that her neighbors had collectively decided she was exactly the right person to hold. Just 3 days before the Memorial Day weekend, Angela had knelt in front of the community center with a tray of flowers and her familiar pair of gardening gloves and filled the window boxes with a colorful, cheerful array of blooms that her neighbors would walk past every day for weeks afterward, without knowing at first that the hands that had placed them there were gone. Angela Spence Shaw's home on Sakonnet Point Road was in the middle of a renovation in the weeks before Memorial Day. A construction crew had been coming in and out of the property, moving through the house with the particular noise and disruption of a building project, sawdust, the smell of fresh lumber, footsteps on the stairs. Among the members of that crew was a 23-year-old man named Jeremy Motika, a Fall River resident who came to the work site each day and who, over the course of the renovation, had been inside Angela's home many times. He knew its layout. He knew its rooms. He had been trusted, as a working tradesman is trusted, with the intimate geography of a private residence. He knew, in other words, more than a stranger would have known. The weekend of May 29th, 1999, was a long one, the holiday weekend opening up before the community like an exhale after the long gray winter. At the construction site on Sakonnet Point Road, Jeremy Motika told the other workers he had finished for the day at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Saturday, May 29th. He was gone to his residence, that he had spent the evening drinking beer, that he had gone briefly to a neighbor's house, and that he had not gone out again. He was specific, and he was calm. At some point in the early hours of Sunday, May 30th, 1999, something catastrophic happened inside Angela Spence Shaw's home on Saconnet Point Road. There were no forced entry marks on the doors or windows, no broken locks, no splintered frames, nothing to suggest that someone had broken in from the outside. Angela had not been expecting trouble. She had likely gone to bed in the quiet confidence of a woman in a safe community, in a home she knew well, with the long weekend ahead and the flowers she had planted 3 days earlier still blooming at the community center windows. Whatever woke her, if she was sleeping, and whatever sequence of terror unfolded in the darkness of her home, it began without warning and without mercy. There were signs of a struggle that stretched from the bedroom to the bathroom, a path of disruption that traced Angela's desperate efforts to protect herself from a person who was larger, younger, and determined to do her harm. She fought. The evidence made that clear, and it made the nature of her courage in those moments impossible to overlook. Angela Spence Shaw was 66 years old, and she fought. The medical examiner who later performed her autopsy was Dr. Elizabeth Lapaceda, the chief medical examiner for the state of Rhode Island, and the testimony she would eventually give in court was among the most devastating elements of the entire case. Dr. Lapaceda described, with the careful precision of her profession, the extent of the injuries that Angela had suffered, extensive external wounds visible across her body, and numerous internal injuries to organs and tissues that bore the marks of sustained, severe blunt force. She described injuries to Angela's genital area that were consistent with forced intercourse, and that, critically, had been inflicted while Angela was still alive. She described injuries so severe that the first responder who attended the scene, an EMT who had known Angela personally, who recognized her, would later say that the beating had left Angela barely recognizable. Angela Spence Shaw died from the combined effect of multiple blunt force injuries and drowning. She had been forced, at some point during or after the assault, into the bathtub of her upstairs bathroom, submerged beneath the water. Alongside her body in the tub, when her friend Sally Craig arrived and found her the next morning, was an electric hair dryer, plugged in, its cord hanging over the edge of the bath into the water below. Sally Craig, confronted with a scene that no one should ever have to witness, reached down with shaking hands and unplugged it. It was Memorial Day Sunday, and Angela Spence Shaw had not come to work at Peckham's greenhouse. That absence was the first signal, the initial tremor of wrongness in a community that prided itself on knowing its own rhythms. Sally Craig, concerned, went to the house on Saconnet Point Road to check on her. She climbed the stairs. She called Angela's name. She found her in the bathroom, in the tub, still wearing the pink night shirt she had put on the night before, everything beneath the waist missing, the hair dryer floating in the water beside her. The call she made from that house set into motion a response that would convulse the entire community. Within hours, Little Compton was a different place. Police vehicles filled the driveway on Saconnet Point Road. The Rhode Island State Police Major Crimes Unit took over the investigation, with Detective Sergeant Stephen Bannon leading the effort. This was not a community accustomed to homicide investigation. This was, in fact, the first murder Little Compton had experienced in 50 years. There was no template for what the town was supposed to do, no institutional memory of how to absorb this kind of grief. What came instead was the raw, unmediated response of a close-knit community confronted with the loss of one of its most beloved members. Within a week of Angela's death, more than 300 Little Compton residents gathered at a memorial service to mourn her, to say, collectively and aloud, that what had been done to Angela Spence Shaw was an outrage that the entire town shared, and that her memory deserved to be honored by the full weight of the community's grief. The investigation moved on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first was the physical examination of the crime scene, which produced a significant and ultimately decisive body of evidence. Because the construction crew had been working inside the home, police understood from the beginning that trace evidence left by any crew member, fingerprints, footprints, biological material, did not, by itself, establish guilt. Anyone working on the renovation could potentially have left marks inside the house. But this calculation could not account for everything. Biological evidence, DNA, collected from the scene was submitted to the Rhode Island State Crime Lab for analysis, where scientists worked to process and compare it against known samples. The second track was the interviews. Police began speaking with everyone connected to the renovation crew, working their way methodically through the roster of men who had spent weeks inside Angela's home. When they reached Jeremy Motika, they told him they were investigating Angela Spence Shaw's murder, and they asked where he had been over the Memorial Day weekend. Motika gave his account. He had worked until around 3 o'clock on Saturday, he said, then gone home and drank beer. He had visited a neighbor's house briefly, he said. He had not left home again that night. He had not gone to Angela Spence Shaw's house. He said this clearly, and he repeated it when pressed. But something Motika did in the days following the discovery of Angela's body told its own story, one that spoke less to innocence than to a man who had reason to be afraid. When investigators returned to the Saconnet Point Road property to continue their work, Motika was among the construction crew members who were present. While on the property, he noticed something that alarmed him, a box marked with the words Rhode Island State Police, which appeared to contain a footprint impression taken from the scene. Almost immediately after that, Motika contacted Patricia, his girlfriend, and asked her to take his shoes to Cape Cod. Not bring them somewhere nearby. Take them away, across state lines, to Cape Cod. Patricia did as he asked. She took the shoes. 2 days later, on June 5th, Motika and the other construction workers were formally called in for questioning. The movement of those shoes was a detail that investigators would not overlook. As the weeks passed and the forensic work at the state crime lab continued, the DNA evidence that had been collected from the scene began to yield its results. The biological material recovered from Angela Spence Shaw's body, material that spoke directly to the identity of the person who had assaulted her, was compared against samples taken from everyone who had been inside the house in any legitimate capacity. One by one, those comparisons produced no match. And then the sample was compared against Jeremy Motika's DNA. It matched. The result was not ambiguous. The DNA collected from Angela Spence Shaw's body during the physical assault matched Jeremy Motika's genetic profile with a certainty that left no reasonable scientific doubt. Investigators confronted him with this finding, and Jeremy Motika flatly denied it. He denied having gone to the house that night. He denied having assaulted Angela. He denied having killed her. He denied it repeatedly, consistently, and without deviation. But the DNA did not change its answer when he denied it. The science remained exactly as it was. Jeremy Motika was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault in the killing of Angela Spence Shaw. The trial began in January 2001 in the Richland County Courthouse, with the full weight of the state's evidence arrayed before a jury that would spend months absorbing the facts of a case that had already become one of the most significant in Rhode Island's recent history. The prosecution built its case on the forensic architecture of the crime. The DNA match, the evidence of the struggle, the medical examiner's testimony about the nature and extent of Angela's injuries, the movements of Motika in the days after the murder, and the deliberate relocation of his shoes at the moment he realized police were taking footprint impressions from the scene. Dr. Elizabeth Lapaceta testified about the full picture of what Angela had suffered, describing the external injuries, the internal damage, the evidence of sexual assault inflicted while the victim was alive, and the ultimate cause of death as a combination of drowning and blunt force trauma. She spoke with the measured, precise language of a forensic professional, but the effect of her words on the courtroom was profound. The humanity of what she described, the ordeal of a 66-year-old grandmother in her own home, in her own bathroom, could not be filtered entirely through clinical terminology. Detective Sergeant Stephen Bannon gave testimony about his investigation and about Motika's statements to police, the composed denials, the alibi that placed him at home all evening, the account that the DNA evidence had effectively dismantled. Witnesses who knew Motika told the court what they had observed. The owner of the cell phone store, or more accurately, those who could speak to his activities in the aftermath of the murder, provided details that filled in the timeline of a man attempting to manage the evidence that surrounded him. Motika's defense centered on two principal arguments: that he had an alibi for the relevant period, and that the fingerprints found at the scene did not link him to the crime. His defense attorney would later acknowledge, in subsequent proceedings, that the defense had not been provided with all the information it was entitled to in order to mount a fully effective defense, a concession that would become the basis of years of post-conviction litigation. But at the time, The jury was presented with a defense case that could not, at its core, adequately explain the DNA. It could not explain how Jeremy Motica's genetic material came to be on the body of Angela Spence Shaw. It could not explain the shoes sent to Cape Cod. It could not explain the movement of a man who, if innocent, had no reason to send his footwear out of state the moment he saw a police box containing impression evidence. In late April 2001, after deliberating on the evidence before them, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of first-degree sexual assault. The court record states with precision that the jury found Motica had committed the murder intentionally while engaged in the commission of first-degree physical assault, and that the murder had been committed in a manner involving torture and aggravated battery, a finding that speaks to the particular horror of Angela's final hours. Judge Martin Donahue sentenced Jeremy Motica to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder charge, with a concurrent life sentence on the sexual assault charge. He was 25 years old when the sentence was handed down, and the mathematical reality of a life without parole sentence is brutal in its arithmetic. Every year of whatever life lay ahead of him would be spent inside the adult correctional institution in Cranston, Rhode Island, for what had been done to Angela Spence Shaw. But Motica did not accept the verdict as the final word. The appeals began almost immediately after his conviction and have continued, in various forms, ever since. He has argued, across multiple legal proceedings and across more than 2 decades, that the Rhode Island State Police planted the DNA evidence used to convict him, that the match between his genetic profile and the material found on Angela's body was manufactured, fabricated, a deliberate act of police misconduct. He has argued that his trial attorney was ineffective, a claim that his own former public defender, Michael DeLauro, gave partial credence to when he acknowledged in a 2026 hearing that the defense had not received all the information it was entitled to. He has argued that his alibi has never been properly tested, that the fingerprint evidence at the scene did not connect him to the crime, and at the time of death calculations used at trial were open to expert challenge. In 2017, the Rhode Island Supreme Court vacated an earlier ruling that had denied his request for post-conviction relief, opening the door to a new round of hearings. In January 2026, Motica, now 50 years old, 26 years removed from the night Angela Spence Shaw died, appeared before a Superior Court judge to argue his case for a new trial. The state's response was measured and firm. A spokesperson for the Rhode Island Attorney General's office stated that while Motica was entitled to his hearing, the state was confident that after a full evidentiary examination, the Superior Court would dismiss the petition as without merit. No decision had been issued as of early 2026. The case that had shaken Little Compton in 1999 remained, in its legal dimensions, unresolved in the courtrooms of Rhode Island more than a quarter of a century later. What does not remain unresolved is Angela. She is, in the memory of the community she served and the people who loved her, entirely clear. She was 66 years old, and she was going to be the president of the Garden Club. She had spent the Thursday before she died on her knees by the community center windows, pressing flowers into soil with the patient, deliberate care of a woman who believed that beautiful things deserved to be tended. She had worked for years at Peckham's greenhouse, surrounded by the living things that she cared for and that, in their way, depended on her. She was somebody's friend, the kind of friend who shows up for work every day and whose absence, on a Sunday morning, immediately triggers a phone call, a drive across town, a check to make sure everything was all right. Little Compton had not experienced a murder in 50 years before the night of May 29, 1999. The town's next 50 years began the morning Sally Craig unplugged a hairdryer from the wall of a bathroom on Saconnet Point Road. Everything that follows, the trial, the conviction, the decades of appeals, the state's continuing insistence that Jeremy Motica is where he belongs, carries within it the echo of that moment, and of the woman who deserved so much better than the end she found in her own home, in the quiet dark of a holiday weekend, while the flowers she had planted 3 days earlier held their color in the morning light. Story 6. The winters in Boone County, Kentucky, arrive without ceremony. They come on the heels of autumn's fading color, settling over the river bluffs and the farmland and the low, wooded hills like a quiet and determined force. By December, the trees along the South Fork Church Road have shed everything they had, leaving only the dark, bare geometry of branches against a pale sky, and the fields between Florence and the Boone-Gallatin County line stretch out in muted shades of brown and gray, interrupted only by the occasional stone fence line or the distant silhouette of a farmhouse. It is hunting country, and in December 1974 it looked very much as it has looked every December since, cold, spare, and deep with silence. On the morning of December 3rd, 1974, a 22-year-old man named Edward Nichols left his parents' home in Florence, Kentucky, and set out for the woods. He was going hunting, he told them, with a friend. He was 22 years old, strong and healthy, someone who had grown up in this part of Kentucky and who knew its terrain with the easy familiarity of a person who had walked it for years. He was deeply embedded in his family, close with his parents, with his sisters, with the tight web of relationships that a loving family builds over a lifetime. No one who knew Edward Nichols had any reason to believe that the man who walked out of that Florence home on a December morning would not return by nightfall. He never came back. The friend Eddie was hunting with that day was a man named David Stites, and the two of them drove out together toward the South Fork Church Road area near the Boone-Gallatin County line, a stretch of farmland and wooded acreage where hunters had gone for generations. At some point during the day, the two men separated in the way that hunters do, moving through the trees along different routes with the understanding that they would meet back at the vehicle by the end of the afternoon. When the light began to fade and the temperature dropped with the particular sharpness of a Kentucky December evening, David Stites walked back to where the car was parked. He waited. Eddie Nichols did not come. Stites reported Eddie missing. A search began. People moved through the woods calling his name, scanning the ground, trying to understand where a healthy 22-year-old man could have gone in a stretch of familiar countryside and simply ceased to exist. No body was found. No sign of violence was discovered. No weapon. No physical evidence of any kind to explain where Eddie Nichols had gone or what had befallen him in those dark December woods. He had walked into the trees that morning, and the trees had swallowed him whole. For the family he left behind, the weeks and months that followed were defined by a particular kind of torment that has no precise name, the grief of not knowing. Eddie's sisters, Janice and the others who had grown up alongside him, and his parents, who had watched him walk out the front door that morning with no premonition of what was coming, were left in a limbo between mourning and hope that is perhaps the cruelest place a family can inhabit. You cannot fully grieve someone when you have no proof of their fate. You cannot stop looking for someone when their body has never been found. You live in the space between loss and uncertainty, and you carry it everywhere you go. Theories spread through the community in the way that theories always do when a mystery is left unfilled. Some people said that Eddie had been accidentally shot, a stray round from another hunter's rifle, a tragic incident covered up out of fear. Others claimed he had been attacked by a wild boar, that the woods in that part of Kentucky harbored animals capable of bringing a man down. And others, cruelly, suggested that Eddie Nichols had simply walked away from his life, that he had chosen to disappear, to leave his family without a word, to start over somewhere else. His sister Janice, decades later, would refute that last theory with a directness born from years of hearing it. She knew her brother. He was too close to his family, too embedded in the relationships that mattered to him, to have walked away from them voluntarily. He was so involved with his sisters and his mom and his dad. One family member told investigators. Very tight-knit family. Eddie Nichols had not run away. That much his family knew in their bones, even when they knew nothing else. The case went cold. It went cold in the way that cases go cold when the evidence is thin, the witnesses are silent, and the years begin to accumulate in a way that makes the past seem unreachable. Law enforcement noted it, filed it, and returned to it occasionally over the following decades, but without a body and without witnesses willing to speak, there was little to work with. The farmland along the South Fork Church Road continued to sit under its winter frosts and its summer heat, holding its secrets with the impassive patience of the earth itself. Decades passed. Janice Kincaid, Eddie's sister, grew older carrying the unanswered question of what had happened to her brother. "I'm not losing hope," she said to a reporter in December 2024, 50 years after his disappearance. "It's just been so long. Those two sentences contain within them a kind of human endurance that is almost impossible to fully measure. The endurance of a family that has waited not 5 years, not 10, but 50, without answers, without closure, without so much as a grave to visit. The person who would eventually begin to break the silence was a detective named Coy Cox of the Boone County Sheriff's Department Homicide and Cold Case Unit. Cox had taken on the Eddie Nichols case in 2015, more than 4 decades after Eddie disappeared, and had worked it on and off ever since with the kind of patient, methodical persistence that cold case investigation demands. He knew, by the time he took the case, that official investigators had long classified Eddie's disappearance as a homicide. There was nothing to suggest an accident, nothing to suggest a departure. Everything pointed to murder. The only question was who had done it, and where the body was, and whether anyone left alive knew the answers to either of those questions. In 2021, nearly half a century after Eddie walked into those woods, something shifted. Detective Cox and his team received information that pointed them toward a woman, the ex-wife of David Stites, the hunting companion who had reported Eddie missing on that December day in 1974. Stites and his ex-wife had long since separated, and she had carried something with her for years that she had not brought to law enforcement. Cox and his colleagues made the drive to find her. When they knocked on her door, she opened it and said something that stopped them cold in the doorway of their own surprise. "I'm surprised no one's been here before." What she told them began to fill in the shape of what had happened on December 3rd, 1974. Her son, Chris Stites, the son of David Stites, Eddie's hunting companion, had been present years earlier during a conversation that his father did not entirely control. In a moment of drunken candor that perhaps David Stites had believed would never leave the room, he had told his son what he had witnessed in the woods on that December day. Chris Stites had carried that story in him, the weight of a secret that belonged to a murder, and at some point he had told it to others, to family members who, when investigators eventually reached them, each corroborated what Chris had said, independently, without knowing what the others had shared. The account that emerged from those interviews was devastating in its clarity. Eddie Nichols had not died alone in the woods through accident or misadventure. On the day of December 3rd, 1974, there had been at least one other person in those woods besides Eddie and David Stites, a man named Bobby Franksman. And between Eddie Nichols and Bobby Franksman, there existed a long-standing conflict, one that had been building for some time before that December morning. The conflict was rooted in a woman with whom Eddie had reportedly been involved, and whose presence in his life had created a tension between the two men that had never been properly resolved. They had argued before. They carried that unfinished argument with them into the woods. On the afternoon that Eddie Nichols disappeared, that argument reignited. Whatever words passed between them in those cold December trees, the confrontation escalated from an argument into a physical altercation. Bobby Franksman struck Eddie first, punching him with a force that should have ended the encounter. But Eddie Nichols, 22 years old, and not the kind of man who quietly absorbed a blow, refused to be intimidated. According to the account that Chris Stites gave his family, and that would eventually reach Detective Cox, Eddie challenged Franksman after the punch. He said something to the effect of, "Is that all you've got?" It was the response of a young man who did not back down, who met aggression with defiance, who did not believe, could not have believed, that what came next was possible. Bobby Franksman reached into his waistband and pulled out a pistol. He shot Edward Nichols in the head. Eddie Nichols died in the woods along the South Fork Church Road, in the county where he had grown up, on a hunting trip that was not what it appeared to be. He was 22 years old. He had a family at home in Florence who would spend the rest of their lives waiting for him to come back, constructing and deconstructing theories of his disappearance, hoping and grieving in alternating cycles for 50 years. And then there was the question of what happened after. Because a death in the woods, witnessed by at least one other person, does not resolve itself. A body has to go somewhere. According to the account that eventually made its way to Detective Cox through Chris Stites and the family members who corroborated it, the person who buried Eddie Nichols was David Stites himself. The man who had been there that day, the man who had reported Eddie missing, the man who had walked back to the car alone and pretended not to know where his friend had gone. Stites had buried Eddie in the earth of that Boone County farmland, somewhere along the South Fork Church Road area, in ground that has held the secret ever since. For more than 40 years, David Stites had lived with that knowledge. He had gone about his life, carrying what he knew about December 3rd, 1974, through all the years in between, through the seasons, through the family that grew around him, through the decades in which Eddie's family asked questions that went unanswered and investigators came and went without finding what they were looking for. Whatever calculations Stites made in maintaining his silence, whatever fear or loyalty or self-preservation kept him from speaking, it held him through most of his life. In December 2022, the Boone County Grand Jury subpoenaed David Stites to testify about what he knew. It was the moment that the law had been working toward for years. The moment when Stites would finally be placed under oath in a formal proceeding and required to account for what had happened in those woods. The subpoena was served. The date was set, and then, the day before David Stites was scheduled to appear before the grand jury, he took his own life. He died without knowing that his attorney had already requested a continuance, that there would have been another day, another opportunity, that the appearance he was dreading was not as immediate as he believed. He died, and with him died the most direct and comprehensive account of where Eddie Nichols was buried. The silence deepened again, but it did not return to what it had been before. Detective Cox had more now than he had ever had: names, a coherent account of events, corroborating witnesses, a clear suspect. The picture of what had happened on December 3rd, 1974 was finally coming into focus, even as the man who could have confirmed the location of Eddie's grave was gone. Cox continued working the case, interviewing people who remained alive and who knew things, attempting to narrow down the search area for where Eddie's body might lie beneath the Boone County earth. In March 2025, Commonwealth's Attorney Lewis Kelly took the sum of what Detective Cox and the Boone County Sheriff's Office had assembled and wrote a letter, a formal legal document addressed to Eddie's family and to the detectives who had worked the case. In that letter, Kelly identified Bobby Franksman by name as the prime suspect in the murder of Edward Nichols, as the man who had pulled the pistol from his waistband on December 3rd, 1974, and ended a 22-year-old life over a dispute that began with a woman and ended with a bullet. There was, however, a reality that no legal document could fully address. Bobby Franksman had died in February. The records show his death predating the letter, making it impossible to indict him, impossible to arrest him, impossible to place him before a jury and compel him to account for what he had done. The man who had killed Eddie Nichols in the Kentucky woods 50 years earlier had died without ever being charged, without ever being made to stand in a courtroom and face the family of the young man he had shot. The law had named him. Justice, in the formal sense, the charges, the trial, the sentence, could not reach him. The Boone County Sheriff's Office updated its list of cold cases in the wake of the investigation, noting next to Eddie's name, in quiet and official language, the word solved alongside the date of December 2024. It is a word that carries a profound amount of weight and simultaneously a profound incompleteness. The case is solved in the sense that investigators know what happened, know who pulled the trigger, have a corroborated account of the event and its immediate aftermath, and have communicated that account formally to the family that waited for it. It is not solved in the sense that Eddie Nichols' body remains somewhere beneath the Kentucky soil, in a location that David Stites knew and took with him when he died, and that other witnesses, living witnesses, have thus far declined to share. Bobby Franksman murdered Ed, that multiple witnesses were present, that life has taken the murderer and one witness, and that others remain alive and are still withholding information, specifically about where Eddie is buried. There are people who know. There are people who have known for 50 years, and they have not spoken. What Eddie Nichols could have done in life is, of course, unknowable. He was 22 years old, living in Florence, Kentucky, in a tight-knit family that loved him, going about the ordinary routines of a young man's life. He did not know, when he walked out his parents' front door on the morning of December 3rd, 1974, that he was making the last journey he would ever make. He did not know that a long-standing argument with a man named Bobby Franksman would reach its terminal point in a wooded field that afternoon, that a pistol would be produced and fired, that the earth of Boone County would be asked to hold what the living could not account for. The farmland near the South Fork Church Road lies as it always has, indifferent and patient, shaped by 50 Kentucky winters and 50 Kentucky springs since the day a 22-year-old man was placed somewhere beneath it. Detective Coy Cox, who has worked this case for a decade and who received the corroboration of a lifetime of family silence when Chris Stite's account finally reached him, has said that he believes the search area for Eddie's body can eventually be narrowed down, that there are people still alive who know, that the earth, with enough careful attention, will give up what it was given. Whether that hope will become a reality, whether Eddie Nichols will one day be found, identified, and returned to the family that has spent 50 years waiting, is a question that remains open over the rolling fields of Boone County. Somewhere in those fields, beneath the frost and the soil and the roots of trees that were saplings in 1974, is the answer to the question that Janice Kincaid and Beth Palmer and every member of the Nichols family has been carrying for half a century. It is the one remaining piece of a case that has been named solved but cannot fully be, until the man it began with is finally, and at last, brought home. Story 7. The chill of a mid-November morning in North Carolina clung to the damp earth. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, a precursor to the deeper freeze of winter. For days, the search had been a frantic, desperate scramble against time, a prayer whispered on the wind by hundreds of volunteers and grim-faced officers. But on this day, the 6th day since she had vanished, the prayer died. In a desolate patch of woods off Highway 87, a place known to local hunters as a dumping ground for deer carcasses, the search came to its heartbreaking end. There, amidst the tangled kudzu vines and fallen leaves, lay the small, still form of a child. She was partially hidden, discarded like a forgotten toy, her bright spirit extinguished in the lonely silence of the forest. The discovery confirmed the fear that had been gnawing at the heart of Fayetteville, North Carolina, for a week. Shaniah Davis, a 5-year-old girl with a smile that could light up a room, was gone forever. The Amber Alert that had blared across the state, a digital plea for a miracle, would now be silenced. The search was over, but the story of how she came to be in this desolate place was just beginning to unravel, revealing a darkness far deeper and more chilling than the woods themselves. Fayetteville, North Carolina, in the autumn of 2009, was a city of contrasts. Home to Fort Bragg, one of the largest military installations in the world, it thrummed with the disciplined energy of soldiers and the quiet resilience of their families. But beyond the neat suburban streets and the patriotic hum, there existed another world, one of transient populations, economic hardship, and the shadows that thrive in such places. It was in this liminal space, in a faded mobile home park called Sleepy Hollow, that the story of Shaniah Davis took its darkest turn. Shaniah was a child of two worlds. For most of her young life, her anchor had been her father, Bradley Lockhart. He was a man who, by all accounts, adored his daughter. Their life together was stable, filled with the simple joys of childhood. He had custody of Shaniah, providing a safe harbor from the turbulence that often surrounded her mother, Antoinette Davis. Shaniah was a bright, happy child, her Aunt Carrie Lockhart Davis would later recall, a little girl who loved her mother deeply despite the instability. Antoinette lived a different life. At 25, she was already a mother of two, struggling to stay afloat in a world that seemed determined to pull her under. She drifted from place to place, her life a chaotic dance with poverty and poor choices. In November 2009, she and her two children, Shaniah and her 7-year-old brother, were living in the front room of a trailer in Sleepy Hollow, sharing the cramped space with her sister, Brenda Davis, and her family. The Department of Social Services had been in contact with the family before, a fact that would later come under scrutiny, but for now, they remained on the periphery of a gathering storm. On October 9, 2009, about a month before the end, Antoinette called and asked to see her daughter. Shaniah, who missed her mother, was excited to go. Her Aunt Carrie drove her over, a simple act of familial duty that would later be replayed in her mind with agonizing clarity. I took Shaniah over there and gave her a kiss goodbye and told her to be a good girl for Aunt Carrie, she remembered. As the little girl ran towards her mother, she turned back for a moment, her small voice calling out, "I love you, Aunt Carrie. I'll see you later." It was the last time her father's side of the family would see her alive. Bradley Lockhart, trusting that a mother would care for her child, agreed to let Shaniah stay with Antoinette for what he thought would be a visit. Antoinette never lived in the best neighborhoods, and of course there was always that concern, he would later admit. But I never was concerned about her caring for her as a mother. This trust, born of a hope that a mother's love would be a sufficient shield, was tragically misplaced. In the month that followed, Shaniah was pulled deeper into the vortex of her mother's world. This world included a man named Mario Andret McNeil. At 29, McNeil was a known figure in the underbelly of Fayetteville. He had a criminal record and a reputation that should have served as a warning. He was also familiar with Antoinette's family. He had previously dated her sister, Brenda, and had even helped pay the deposit for the very trailer where Antoinette and her children were now staying. He knew the layout of the mobile home. He knew how to get in, even when the door was locked. He was a ghost from a past life, about to become the agent of a future nightmare. The night of November 9th, 2009, bled into the early morning of November 10th with a haze of drugs and desperation. Mario McNeil, fueled by drugs and liquor, was sending out a series of text messages, casting a digital net for female companionship. He tried to contact Brenda Davis, but her phone was off. He then arranged to meet another woman who also lived in Sleepy Hollow, but she fell asleep before he arrived. At 3:06 a.m., he texted her good night. His search for a connection had failed, but his night was not over. Inside the trailer, Antoinette Davis was trapped. She owed a drug debt, a mere $200, a sum that in her world was a mountain. The pressure was mounting, and she was out of options. In a decision that would defy all comprehension, a choice that would forever brand her not as a mother, but as a monster in the eyes of the world, she decided to settle her debt. The currency she chose to use was her own daughter. What exactly was said in the moments leading up to the transaction remains locked in the memories of the two people who orchestrated it. But the outcome is brutally clear. Antoinette Davis agreed to give her 5-year-old daughter to Mario McNeil. In a later, chillingly detached confession to police, she would lay out the terms of the deal with a simplicity that belied its horror. She just gave her for $200. They were just supposed to have sex. In the pre-dawn darkness, McNeil approached the trailer. It is not known if he entered or if Antoinette brought Shaniah to him, but at some point, the small, sleeping child was transferred from the supposed safety of her mother's care into the arms of a predator. The exchange was made. A debt was paid. A life was sold. Hours later, as the sun rose over Fayetteville, Antoinette Davis picked up the phone and dialed 911. She reported her daughter, Shaniah, as missing. She told the dispatcher that she had put her children to bed, and when she woke up, the 5-year-old was gone. The lie was the final betrayal, a cowardly attempt to mask an unspeakable act. The search for Shaniah Davis had begun, but from the very first moment, it was a search predicated on a deception, a race against a clock that had already run out. The initial report of a missing 5-year-old girl, seemingly vanished from her bed in the dead of night, sent a ripple of alarm through the Fayetteville Police Department. A child abduction is one of the most urgent calls a police department can receive, and resources were immediately mobilized. The story Antoinette told was terrifying. She had last seen her daughter around 5:30 a.m., and when she checked again, the front door was ajar and Shaniah was gone. The first 24 hours were a blur of activity. Officers canvassed Sleepy Hollow Mobile Home Park, knocking on doors, searching the surrounding woods. Their questions met with a mixture of concern and fear from residents. An Amber Alert was issued, sending Shaniah's smiling school picture across the state, her name and description flashing on highway signs and television screens. She was described as a black female, approximately 3 feet tall and 40 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. The alert was a beacon of hope, a call to a million eyes to be on the lookout for a little girl in her pajamas. But as the investigation deepened, inconsistencies in Antoinette's story began to emerge. Her timeline of events shifted under questioning. Her demeanor struck some investigators as oddly detached for a mother whose child was missing. The focus, which had initially been on an unknown kidnapper, began to slowly, cautiously, turn towards the family itself. A break in the case came from a witness who reported seeing a man leaving the trailer park with a child in his car. This led police to a man named Clarence Coe, who was arrested on kidnapping charges. It was a promising lead, but it quickly turned into a dead end. Coe was not their man. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a hotel in Sanford, a town about 40 miles north of Fayetteville. An employee at the Comfort Suites Hotel saw the Amber Alert and recognized the little girl. They contacted the police with a piece of information that would blow the case wide open. Hotel surveillance video, timestamped at 6:11 a.m. on Tuesday, November 10th, before Antoinette had even reported her daughter missing, showed a man carrying a small child, unmistakably Shaniah Davis, down a hallway. The man in the video was identified as Mario Andrette McNeil. The footage was grainy, but the image was clear and devastating. McNeil, with the child draped limply in his arms, walked with a chilling purpose. He carried her not with the tenderness of a father, but with the grim possessiveness of a captor. This single piece of evidence changed everything. It transformed the case from a mysterious abduction into a manhunt for a known suspect. The connection between McNeil and Shaniah's family was not immediately known to the public, but for investigators, the puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into a horrifying picture. With McNeil identified as the man in the video, the Amber Alert was updated and upgraded to a nationwide alert. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing federal resources to bear on the now frantic search. Bradley Lockhart, Shaniah's distraught father, made a desperate public plea. His voice choked with emotion, he spoke to the cameras, his words a direct appeal to his missing daughter and her abductor. "Shaniah, if you are listening to Daddy, I miss you so much. I'm not going to give up," he pleaded. But as the search parties fanned out, investigators were uncovering the sordid truth behind her disappearance. The drug debt narrative began to leak out, and suspicion fell squarely on Antoinette Davis. On November 14th, for days after she reported her daughter missing, Antoinette was in a police interrogation room. She was pregnant, emotionally distraught, and now being treated not as a grieving mother, but as a suspect. Detectives pressed her, urging her to go down the right path. Her defense would later argue she was coerced, that police promised she could walk out if she just told them something. In that room, under the weight of her guilt and the pressure of the investigation, the dam broke. She admitted to her role in the tragedy, uttering the words that confirmed the police's worst fears. She had sold her daughter for $200. The next day, Antoinette Nicole Davis was arrested and charged with human trafficking, felony child abuse, and prostitution-related offenses. The arrest of the mother for selling her child was a shocking twist that stunned the nation. The case was no longer just a kidnapping. It was a story of unimaginable betrayal. But one crucial question remained. Where was Shaniah? The arrest of Antoinette Davis cast a pall over the search for Shaniah. The hope for a joyful reunion began to curdle into a grim resignation. The focus of the investigation now was on finding Mario McNeil. He was the only person who knew where Shaniah was, the only one who held the key to ending the agonizing uncertainty. On November 13th, 3 days after the abduction, McNeil was arrested. He admitted to kidnapping the little girl, a partial confession that acknowledged his presence at the scene, but left the most important questions unanswered. He was initially charged with kidnapping, but he refused to say what had happened to Shaniah or where she could be found. For investigators, it was a frustrating dead end. They had their suspect in custody, but the little girl was still missing. As McNeil sat in a jail cell, his family hired an attorney, Alan Rogers, to represent him. McNeil, facing the terrifying prospect of a capital murder charge, began to talk to his lawyer. What he said was protected by attorney-client privilege, one of the most sacred principles in the American legal system. But McNeil's confession to his lawyer created a profound ethical and legal dilemma. He told his legal team that Shaniah was dead, and he told them where he had left her body. His lawyers now faced a wrenching decision. Their duty was to their client, to protect his rights and provide him with a vigorous defense. But they also possessed information that could bring a measure of closure to a grieving family and a horrified community. They decided to act. Believing they had secured an agreement with prosecutors that the information would not be used against their client, a deal prosecutors would later deny ever existed, McNeil's lawyers approached the authorities. They provided a map, directing investigators to a remote, wooded area off NC Highway 87, near the line between Lee and Harnett counties. On Monday, November 16, 2009, law enforcement followed the map. The search, which had been a sprawling, desperate effort, was now narrowed to a single, grim location. As officers and search teams moved into the woods, the atmosphere was thick with foreboding. About 100 feet off the road, in a patch of undergrowth, they found her. The discovery of Shaniah's body was a moment of profound sorrow that rippled through the entire state. Captain Mark Bidgman of the Fayetteville Police, a veteran officer, would later describe it as the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my career. The hope that had sustained the community for 6 long days was extinguished in an instant, replaced by a cold, hard grief. The state medical examiner's office performed an autopsy. The findings were brutal and unequivocal. Dr. Thomas Clark testified that Shaniah had been brutally raped, with injuries that were highly likely to have been inflicted before her death. The cause of death was not strangulation, as initially suspected, but asphyxiation. She had been smothered. Based on the state of decomposition, the medical examiner estimated her body had been left in the woods for about a week, meaning she was likely killed on the same day she was taken. With the discovery of the body and the autopsy results, the charges against Mario McNeil were upgraded. He now faced first-degree murder, first-degree rape of a child, and a slew of other charges related to kidnapping and sexual servitude. He was now a man facing the death penalty. During his court appearance for the new charges, District Court Judge George Franks laid out the stark reality of his situation. You're charged with first-degree murder. In the state of North Carolina, that's punishable by the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole. McNeil was moved to Raleigh's Central Prison for his own safety and placed on suicide watch. The case of Shaniah Davis had reached its tragic conclusion. The little girl who loved her mother was dead. The mother who sold her was in jail. And the man who bought, brutalized, and killed her was facing a trial for his life. The search was over, but the quest for justice was just beginning. The legal fallout from Shaniah Davis's murder proceeded down 2 separate but intertwined paths. One was the case against the mother who had made the unthinkable choice to sell her child. The other was against the man who had carried out the horrific acts that followed. Both cases would be heard in a Cumberland County courtroom, under the glare of national media and the watchful eyes of a community demanding retribution. Antoinette Davis was a puzzle. In her court appearances, she often appeared emotionless, a blank slate that gave no hint of the turmoil within. Yet, in her tearful apology to Shaniah's father, Bradley Lockhart, she presented the image of a remorseful mother who had been overwhelmed by circumstances. "I never said I was a perfect mother, but I was a good mother," she claimed. "I did what I had to do to provide." It was a statement that stood in stark, irreconcilable contrast to the facts of the case. Her defense attorneys fought to suppress her confession, arguing that the police had used coercive techniques on a woman who was pregnant, sick, and emotionally fragile. They claimed detectives had created the impression that her freedom was contingent on her admitting to something, anything. The judge, however, was not convinced. Judge Jim Ammons ruled that there was no evidence of threats, and that Davis had been told she was free to leave the interview. Her confession, the damning admission of selling her daughter for sex, would be allowed as evidence. Facing a trial for first-degree murder and the prospect of life in prison without parole, Antoinette Davis and her lawyers decided to make a deal. On October 17, 2013, she stood before Judge Ammons and entered an Alford plea. Under North Carolina law, this plea was a legal tightrope walk. She did not admit guilt, but she conceded that prosecutors had enough evidence to likely secure a conviction. She pleaded to a lesser charge of second-degree murder, as well as first-degree kidnapping, sexual servitude of a child, and human trafficking. Before sentencing her, Judge Ammons delivered a scathing rebuke. "You had the opportunity, the means, to save Shaniah's life, and you did not," he told her directly. "You are not a good mother." Bradley Lockhart, the father whose trust she had betrayed, was also in the courtroom. In a moment of almost incomprehensible grace, he offered forgiveness. "I forgave you a long time ago, and Shaniah did too," he said, his words a testament to a spirit not broken by grief. Antoinette Davis was sentenced to between 17.5 and 21 years in prison. For a crime of such magnitude, the sentence struck many as lenient, but it was the result of a calculated legal strategy that spared her from a life behind bars. She was sent to serve her time, a living symbol of a mother's ultimate betrayal. Her appeal of the conviction was later denied. Mario McNeil's path to justice was more complex and fraught with legal battles. Unlike Antoinette, he did not seek a deal. He maintained his innocence, even as the evidence against him mounted. His trial began in April 2013. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Billy West, laid out its case with methodical precision. They presented the hotel surveillance video, the DNA evidence found on Shaniah's body, and the testimony of witnesses who placed McNeil in Sleepy Hollow on the night of the abduction. The state offered McNeil a plea deal, plead guilty to first-degree murder, and they would take the death penalty off the table, leaving him with a sentence of life in prison. McNeil refused. His defense team launched a multi-pronged attack. They argued that McNeil's original attorneys had violated his attorney-client privilege by revealing the location of Shaniah's body, and that all evidence flowing from that discovery should be suppressed. The judge denied the motion, ruling there was no evidence of a binding agreement with the state. The defense also tried to cast suspicion elsewhere, revealing a bizarre and tangled web of relationships. McNeil had dated Shaniah's aunt for 3 months prior to the murder. They even claimed images found on McNeil's phone were of the aunt, not another minor, in an attempt to get separate child exploitation charges dismissed. The trial was a grim, emotionally taxing affair. Jurors were shown autopsy photos, causing some of Shaniah's relatives to flee the courtroom in tears. The defense objected but was overruled. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. In May 2013, after deliberating for less than an hour, the jury found Mario McNeil guilty of first-degree murder, first-degree rape of a child, and first-degree kidnapping. The trial then moved to the penalty phase. The same jury that had convicted him would now decide his fate, life in prison or death. McNeil, in a final act of defiance or resignation, chose not to present any mitigating evidence in his defense. He would not fight for his life. The jury, once again, did not take long to reach a decision. On May 29, 2013, they recommended that Mario McNeil be sentenced to death. McNeil's legal battles did not end there. He appealed his conviction and sentence, arguing that he had received ineffective counsel and that his rights had been violated. In 2018, the North Carolina Supreme Court heard his appeal. His new lawyers argued passionately that he deserved a new trial because his original attorneys had betrayed his confidence. The court, however, was not swayed. They upheld his conviction and his death sentence, finding that he had received a fair trial. Mario McNeil remains on death row, the final chapter of his story yet to be written. The convictions of Antoinette Davis and Mario McNeil brought a form of legal closure to the tragedy of Shaniah Davis, but the wounds left by her death ran deep and spread far beyond the courtroom. Her case became a haunting cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. The case of Shaniah Davis is a story about the monstrosity of a single act, the brutal murder of a child. But it is also a story about the quieter, more insidious evils that pave the way for such acts: poverty, drug addiction, systemic failures, and the terrifying void that can open up when a mother's love fails. It is the story of a 5-year-old girl, sold for the price of a drug fix, who was carried into the darkness by a man and left in the woods. She was a daughter, a niece, a friend. Her name was Shaniah, and she deserved so much more. Her story, in its heartbreaking detail, is a demand that we do not look away, a promise that she will not be forgotten,